The first thing I remember clearly is the sound of the ventilator. Not the pain. That came later, when they pulled the tube. Not the faces of the nurses. They blurred in and out like figures seen through frosted glass. The first thing I remember is the rhythm of that machine, breathing for me. In, out. In, out. Steady and indifferent, the way a metronome doesn't care what song you're playing. I had a pocket watch on the table beside me, my father's. Brass case, white face, Roman numerals. The nurses had put it there because I'd been holding it when they wheeled me into pre-op, and some quiet soul had understood that a man doesn't grip a dead man's watch for no reason. It sat on the table. I couldn't reach it for the first 3 days. I could only see it. And I counted seconds the way a carpenter counts the grain of wood before he makes the first cut. Slowly, with attention, because the number matters. On the 9th day, I reached for it. No one had come. Not one of my 4 children had walked through that door. And I want to tell you exactly how that happened. Not the way grief tells a story, rushing past the details to get to the wound. I want to tell it the way I built things for 40 years, one measurement at a time, because the devil is always in the gap between what you planned and what you built. By the time I finish, you'll know the answer to the only question that mattered to me in that room. Who decided that my life, the one I built, board by board, nail by nail, sacrifice by sacrifice, was no longer worth showing up for? My name is Walter Greer. I'm 68 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house I built myself on a hillside lot that everyone else said was too steep to build on. That was 1987. The house is still standing. I checked the foundation last spring. It's solid. I was a carpenter for 41 years. Not the kind who installs kitchen cabinets on a Tuesday and moves on. The structural kind. Timber framing, load-bearing walls, the bones of buildings. I spent my working life thinking about what holds things up, what keeps a roof from becoming a floor, what happens when you skip a step because you're tired or in a hurry, or because someone told you it didn't matter. It always matters. My father was a carpenter too, his father before him. There is, in my family, a specific knowledge that lives in the hands before it lives in the head. The way a piece of wood wants to split, the direction of the grain, the sound a joint makes when it's right versus the sound it makes when it's almost right, but will fail in 20 years. Almost right is the most dangerous thing in construction. It looks like right. It passes inspection. It fails on a cold January morning when the stress is highest, and you're not there to see it happen. My wife Ruth understood this about me before I could explain it. She used to say I talk to wood the way other men talk to God, quietly, with patience, and with the understanding that I was the one who needed to listen. She died 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to gone. She was 51 years old. I kept working. What else do you do when the center beam fails? You don't tear down the house. You find another way to distribute the load. I had 4 children by then, 3 daughters and a son. Carol, the oldest, who lives in Charlotte with her husband Dennis and their 2 teenagers. Mira, the second, who moved to Phoenix 12 years ago and calls every Sunday, or used to. James, my son, who manages a logistics company in Atlanta, and who I raised to shake a man's hand and mean it. And Diane, the youngest, who lives 40 minutes from me in Weaverville, close enough to drop in, which she did, reliably, until she didn't. I retired 6 years ago, not because my hands gave out, because my knees did. 40 years of kneeling on subflooring will do that. I sold my tools, most of them, to a young man named Felix Torres, who had the right kind of hunger in his eyes. I kept the level. A 32-inch starret, yellow, with a bubble still dead center after 40 years. I keep it on the mantel. Ruth used to say it was the most honest thing in the house. It's still there. I look at it every morning. It doesn't lie. 6 months before the surgery, I had a routine stress test. My cardiologist, Dr. Amara Osei, she's 43, precise, the kind of doctor who gives you information like a blueprint, clear lines and no unnecessary notation. She looked at the results and said we needed to talk. We sat in her office and she spread the imaging on the desk the way I used to spread architectural drawings, and she showed me the blockage. 90% in the left anterior descending. She said it plainly. Walter, this is serious. This isn't a question of whether you need surgery. It's a question of when. I asked her how long I had without it. She said that wasn't the right question. I said, all right, when do we do it? We scheduled it for the 14th of March. I had 6 weeks. I spent them the way I spend any preparation, making sure everything was in order. I wrote a letter to each of my children. Not a will. I have a will. It's filed with my attorney. These were different. Personal. The kind of thing a man writes when he's honest about the possibility that he might not come back from something. I mailed them. Certified. Each one received. I heard back from Carol, who called and said, Dad, don't be dramatic. You're going to be fine. I heard back from James, who texted to say he was sure the doctors were great. Mira called twice, left one message that mentioned she might be able to get out for the surgery if her work schedule cleared. Diane came over for dinner 2 nights before I went in. She sat at my kitchen table and ate the roast chicken I made and talked about her daughter's soccer schedule and her bathroom renovation, and did not once mention that in 48 hours I would be on a table with my chest open. I didn't push. I wasn't sure what I wanted from them exactly. I think I wanted someone to sit in the quiet with me and let it be serious. But I didn't ask for that, and I don't blame them entirely for not offering what I didn't ask for. What I didn't know yet was that not showing up for the surgery was only the first of the absences. The one that would follow was different. The one that would follow had a reason. His name was Dennis. Carol's husband Dennis is 47 years old. He sells commercial real estate in Charlotte. Office buildings, warehouse space, the kinds of transactions that move in millions and take years to close. He is broad-shouldered, loud at dinner tables, and has never in 11 years looked at me as though I was something worth paying attention to. I noticed it before I had a name for it. The way he'd redirect a conversation when I was mid-sentence. The way he'd summarize what I'd said to the room as though I hadn't said it clearly enough myself. The way he'd offer to explain things to me, slowly, with the exaggerated care of someone talking to a person who might not follow, when I had not asked to have anything explained. I filed it under personality and let it go. Ruth would have liked him less than I did. She had a good ear for performance. The first time I understood what Dennis actually thought of me was Christmas, 2 years before the surgery. We were at Carol's house in Charlotte, 14 people around a table that Carol had set beautifully, and the conversation had turned to Carol's investment accounts. She'd mentioned she was thinking of moving some money around, consolidating things. Dennis looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who has already decided the meeting is over before it started, and he said, Walter, I'm sure you're comfortable with what you have. At your age, honestly, you probably don't need to be thinking about this stuff. It gets complicated. There was a beat of silence. Not a long one. The kind that fills in quickly at a dinner table when people are pretending they didn't hear something. I didn't answer him. I picked up my fork and went back to my food. Carol looked at her plate. Mira, across from me, met my eyes for 1 second. She looked away. At your age. 2 words, 14 people. No one said a thing. I didn't know then what those 2 words were going to cost me. I didn't know how far Dennis had already taken that sentence in his own mind, or what he'd built on top of it. I found out later. I found out from a document I wasn't supposed to see, in a waiting room I wasn't supposed to be in, on a morning that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. A good carpenter measures twice. Let me measure. I went into surgery at 6:45 in the morning on March 14th. The anesthesiologist was a young woman with red-framed glasses who told me to count backward from 10. I got to 7. I came back in the ICU. I don't know how much later. Days blur there. You sleep and wake without knowing which one is which. The light doesn't change, the machines don't stop. A nurse named Thomas, young, broad hands, wore his scrubs like a man who'd been up since before the light, was the first face I recognized as a face, not a shape. He told me the surgery had gone well. He told me I was stable. He told me I'd had a visitor. I said, "Who?" He looked at his chart. "A Dr. Osei. She checked in on you yesterday." "My cardiologist, not family." "No one else?" I asked. He paused. The pause was its own answer. "Not while I've been on shift," he said. Then, carefully, "Sometimes people can't make it. Mostly work. They call, though. I'm sure they called." I didn't say anything. I looked at the ceiling. There's a particular kind of grid that hospitals use. Acoustic tile, 2 by 2 squares. And I found myself counting the tiles in the section directly above me. 17 across, 9 rows deep. Bad measurements. Rooms shouldn't come out to odd numbers if you're planning them right. I lay there for 9 days. Thomas was on shift 5 of them. We talked, the way men do in quiet rooms, in short sentences, with long pauses between them that didn't need filling. He told me he was from Roanoke originally, had 2 boys. His wife was finishing her nursing degree. He told me about a house he wanted to build someday, out of his own pocket, something modest but solid. I told him what to look for in a contractor. We talked about wood. On the 3rd day, Diane called. I heard her voice through the phone, and I felt the relief of it move through me like warmth through a cold joint. She sounded rushed, the way she always sounds rushed. 3 children, a job, the soccer schedule, the renovation. She said she was so glad I was okay. She said she'd been thinking about me constantly. She said the drive up was just hard with everything going on. Weaverville is 40 minutes away. I said, "I understand." She said, "We'll come see you soon as you're home." I said, "That sounds good." She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. And I did. I do. Love and disappointment are not opposites. I learned that the hard way with Ruth. Not from any failure of our marriage, but from watching her face in the months before the end, when she was in pain and I couldn't fix it. And I loved her more than I'd ever loved anything, and could do nothing. Nothing at all. And both of those things were true at the same time. Carol texted on day 5. "Thinking of you, Dad. Dennis says hi." I didn't respond. I'm not sure why. James called on day 7 and talked for 11 minutes about a logistics deal he was trying to close, and then said, "But how are you doing? Seriously?" I told him I was recovering. He said, "That's great, Dad. That's really great." And then said he had a meeting he needed to get to. Mira didn't call until day 8. She was crying when she did, which startled me. She apologized, said she'd been watching her phone, hadn't known what to say, hadn't wanted to call and make it worse somehow. I told her she wouldn't have made it worse. There was a silence. Then she said, "Dad, is there something going on with the house?" I didn't know what she meant. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She went quiet for a moment. Then, Dennis said you'd talked about selling, that you were thinking about options. I had never said that to Dennis. I had never said that to anyone. I didn't know then what I know now. I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me stay with the room for a moment longer, because the room matters. The 9 days matter. Not as proof of anything. I'm not collecting grievances like a man building a case. I'm telling you this because what happened in the room is what made everything else visible. When you're stripped down to the minimum, a bed, a machine, a pocket watch you can't reach, you see the structure of things, what's load-bearing, what's been built on a lie. On the 9th day, I reached for my father's watch. I turned it over in my palm. The brass was warm from the lamp. The second hand swept steadily around the face, indifferent to the 9 days I'd just lived through. I thought about my father, a quiet man, same shape of hands as mine, who built furniture when he wasn't building houses, and who never said anything he didn't mean. He left me 2 things, the watch and the level. He said the watch was for knowing when time was being wasted, and the level was for knowing when something was true. Both of them were about the same thing, really. I got out of the ICU on day 10, moved to a regular room. Dr. Osei came by that afternoon. She'd been checking on me every other day, I learned, even when I wasn't aware of it. And she sat down in the chair beside my bed and asked me how I was actually doing. Physically, I said. She looked at me evenly. And otherwise? I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Dr. Osei, did anyone from my family call the hospital? She looked at her tablet. She looked at me. I can check with the nursing team, but... Walter, you should rest. You can sort out family things when you're stronger. I am strong enough, I said. She nodded. She was too good a doctor to argue with a recovering patient about what he was strong enough for. I went home on March 24th. A neighbor, Earl Baisden, retired schoolteacher, 71 years old, drove me. He'd offered the day he heard about the surgery. He brought soup that his wife had made, 2 containers of it, and set them in my refrigerator without being asked. That's a specific kindness, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I sat in my living room and looked at the level on the mantel. The bubble was centered. Something in the house was straight. Then I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. The paper I wasn't supposed to see. Let me tell you about a Tuesday in late January, 6 weeks before the surgery. I'd driven to Charlotte for a follow-up appointment at a specialist's office, a cardiologist who worked with Dr. Osei's practice, second opinion on the imaging. The office was downtown, on the 4th floor of a building I'd driven past 100 times. I parked, went up, and was told there'd been a scheduling error. My appointment had been moved, and someone had failed to call me. I sat in the waiting room because the nurse said the doctor could still see me if I was willing to wait 40 minutes. I was willing. I had nowhere else to be. The waiting room was the kind you forget immediately. Beige walls, muted television, chairs that don't quite commit to being comfortable. There was a stack of folders on the check-in counter, the kind with color-coded tabs that medical offices use for sorting. 2 of the admin staff were talking behind the desk in the way people talk when they think they're quiet enough. Voices low but carrying, the consonants sharp. I was looking at a magazine without reading it when I heard my name. Not called, mentioned. Greer account, the Charlotte referral, Carol Greer's father. I looked up. The woman at the desk was talking to someone on the phone. She had a folder open. I could see from where I sat that it was a printed document, not a medical form. It was formatted differently, columns, numbers, not a chart. She said, "The family's interested in the valuation. Yes, the whole property, the Asheville address." Then she lowered her voice and turned away. I put the magazine down. I held it in my lap for a moment. My hands were steady. That surprised me later, that my hands were steady. A carpenter's hands know when something is structurally wrong before the mind has finished the calculation. They go still. They wait. When she got off the phone, I went to the counter and asked her what firm she'd been speaking with. She looked at me blankly. I told her my name. The color went out of her face.
"Mr. Greer," she said, "I'm so sorry. That call was... I shouldn't have. I apologize."
I asked her again, calmly, what firm. She looked at her computer. She looked at me. She said the name of a real estate company, commercial and residential, Charlotte-based. Dennis's firm. I thanked her. I went back to my seat. The specialist saw me 20 minutes later and told me what Dr. Osei had already told me, that the surgery was necessary. I drove home to Asheville. I made dinner. I ate it alone. I washed the dishes. I didn't call Carol. Not yet. I didn't call anyone. A carpenter doesn't cut until he's measured. He doesn't measure until he knows where the line is. I didn't know yet where the line was. I knew the shape of something. I knew the grain. I needed to find the actual structure. Here is what I didn't know that Tuesday evening, eating dinner alone, that I would know 8 weeks later. Dennis had been talking to my children. Not all of them, but Carol and James, the two most likely to listen to a man in a good suit with a confident voice, about what he called a practical plan for Dad's situation. He had pulled numbers. He had, without asking me, without even hinting to me, commissioned an appraisal of my property, the house I built, the hillside, the workshop behind it. He had presented my children with a proposal. Sell the house, take the equity, put me somewhere smaller, more appropriate, he'd said, for a man my age. He had started this conversation 6 months before my surgery. He had continued it during my surgery. He had been continuing it while I lay in the ICU. And the reason no one had come to that hospital was not negligence. It was not distance. It was not the press of busy lives. It was that Dennis had told Carol, and Carol had told James, and James had told Diane, that the doctors believed my recovery would be complicated. He'd used that word, complicated, and that it would be better to wait, to not overwhelm me, to let the medical team do their work, and that he, Dennis, was handling the logistics of what came next. He was handling the logistics. I was in the ICU, and he was handling my logistics. At your age, Walter, I want to be careful here. I want to be as precise as a man with a level, because imprecision in this part of the story would be its own kind of dishonesty. Dennis is not a monster. I have thought about this at length, and I will not reduce him to something easier than he is. He is a man who looked at me, at my age, at my house on a hillside, at my quiet voice at dinner tables, at the tools I no longer carry, and made a calculation. The calculation was wrong, but it had its own logic. He looked at the outside of the structure, and he did not see what was holding it up. That is a professional error. I have seen it 100 times. Men who look at an old building and see only the surface, the weathered siding, the dated hardware, and miss entirely that the bones are perfect, that the joinery is exact, that the thing will stand for another 100 years if you leave it alone. Dennis looked at me and saw weathered siding. His motive was not pure malice. His motive was, I think, something like this. Carol's inheritance, made liquid sooner rather than later, controlled and managed by a man who believed he understood money better than a retired carpenter. Ambition, impatience, the quiet certainty of a man who has spent his life being the most useful person in the room. There was also, I think, something simpler. He didn't like me. He'd never liked me. I was not the kind of man he respected. I didn't talk about numbers. I didn't wear the right things. I didn't have a title that translated easily at dinner parties. And a man like Dennis, who has spent his life sorting people by their legibility, can't fully trust what he can't read. That's not an excuse, but it's what I believe, because I spent 40 years looking at what other people built and learning to see not just the mistake, but the thinking behind the mistake. Mistakes don't happen by accident. They happen because of something that was true for the builder in the moment. A shortcut that seemed reasonable, an assumption that wasn't checked, a measurement that was almost right. Dennis's mistake was almost right for a long time. That's why it worked. I spent the weeks after I came home from the hospital being careful, not letting on, building a different kind of structure, the kind you can't see until it's finished. My attorney, Margaret Ellison, she's 62, has been practicing in Asheville for 30 years, has a reputation for being precise to the point of being frightening. Listened to what I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walter, you didn't authorize any appraisal?" "No." "You didn't discuss selling with Dennis?" "I have never had a conversation with Dennis about my property. In 11 years. She looked at her notes. She looked at me. "All right," she said. "Let's see what was actually filed." What was actually filed, as it turned out, was more than an appraisal. Dennis had, without my knowledge or consent, engaged a real estate firm to assess the property as part of what he'd described to them as a family estate planning process. He had represented himself as a family representative. He had used my daughter's name. He had not used mine. The firm had produced a report. The report had been shared with Carol. Carol had shared it with James. Mira had not been told. Diane had been told, selectively, in a way that made it sound like I had initiated the conversation. Margaret laid this out for me not as a crime. It may be a civil matter, depending on what was done with the report, but as a pattern. "This is someone who has been building something," she said. "He just assumed you weren't paying attention." I thought about the 2 words at the Christmas dinner table. At your age. "He assumed correctly," I said. "Until now." She smiled. It was a small smile, precise, without excess. "That's why they always assume it, until now." I should tell you about Felix. Felix Torres, the young man I'd sold most of my tools to when I retired. 29 years old, born in Waynesville, started framing houses at 19. When I sold him the tools, I made him sit down with me for 3 hours, and I explained each one. Not how to use them. He knew how to use them. I explained what they built. The houses, the load-bearing walls, the joints. I told him a tool carries the memory of its work. He looked at me like I was a little crazy. Then he nodded. I think he understood more than he let on. Felix had done some work for me in the years since. Small repairs, the kind of thing I could no longer do on my knees. He'd been checking on the house during my surgery. I called him the week after I got home and asked him to come by. He sat in the same chair Earl Basden's wife's soup had been eaten from, and I told him some of what was happening. Not all of it. Enough. He said, "Do you need the house assessed? Like, officially? What it's actually worth?" I said that would be useful, yes. He said, "I know a guy. Independent. No connection to Charlotte." I said, "That would be very useful." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Walter, you okay?" He was the first person who'd asked me that, and meant it as more than a formality. I noticed that. I kept it. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm measuring." He nodded. He got up and shook my hand. I didn't know then that Felix would be in the room when everything came clear. I didn't know he'd be the one who noticed the detail I'd almost missed. That came later. 19 days later, when he texted me a photograph of a document I'd never seen. And I sat with it for a long time before I understood what it meant. Margaret moved carefully. That's what good attorneys do. They don't rush the cut. They mark the line first. She sent letters. She requested documents. She had a colleague reach out to the real estate firm in Charlotte that Dennis had engaged. What came back was precise and damaging. Dennis had represented to the real estate firm that he was acting as coordinator for the Greer family estate transition. He had provided Carol's email address as a point of contact. He had framed the appraisal as preliminary research for a voluntary family decision to consolidate assets.
The appraisal had been prepared and invoiced. The invoice had been paid, not by Carol and James, not by Dennis personally. It had been charged to a joint account that Carol and I had opened years ago for house maintenance purposes. An account I had largely forgotten about. An account that still had Carol's name on it. That account had been used to pay for a secret assessment of my own property. That was the measurement that made everything else make sense. Not the duplicity alone. Duplicity I could have understood, even forgiven, as the work of a man who convinced himself he was being helpful. What I couldn't forgive was the specific mechanism. Charging my own money to assess my own home, without my knowledge, for the purpose of planning its sale. That was not impatience. That was not ambition wearing the mask of helpfulness. That was a man who had decided, in full and cold calculation, that my account, my signature, my money, my life, were already no longer mine to manage. At your age. There it was, the full sentence. He'd been building it for 2 years. He'd just never said the rest out loud, where I could hear it. Felix's photograph arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a copy of the original appraisal document, the cover page, with the charge reference. He'd gotten it from the firm's assistant, a woman he knew through a mutual contact in the trades, who had been uncomfortable with how the engagement had been framed from the start, and had held a copy against exactly this kind of moment. I sat with the photograph for a while. I looked at my father's watch. The second hand moved. I called Margaret. She said, "That's the piece we needed." I said, "What's the next step?" She said, "The next step is a conversation, but not just with Dennis." Margaret arranged a meeting. I won't call it a confrontation. That word makes it sound hotter than it was. It was, in form, a family conversation about the property and my estate planning. Margaret suggested it as a clarity meeting, my term, which I offered and which she adopted because it was accurate. I wanted clarity, not theater, not ceremony. I wanted the structure visible, load-bearing wall exposed, so everyone in the room could see what had been built in the dark. We met at Margaret's office in downtown Asheville on a Saturday morning in late April. Carol and Dennis drove up from Charlotte. James flew in from Atlanta. When the meeting was described to him in writing, formally, he didn't delay. Mira joined by video from Phoenix. Diane came in person. She sat next to me at the table without sitting next to Dennis, which told me something about what she'd already figured out. Dennis walked into that room with the posture of a man who has pre-managed the situation. Confident, slightly too casual. He shook hands with Margaret with the handshake of a man who was used to being the most important person in a room, and is politely tolerating being in someone else's space. He sat down next to Carol and crossed his ankle over his knee and looked at the table as though he'd already seen the agenda and found it manageable. Margaret opened the meeting. She laid out the facts in the order they had happened, not editorialized, not dramatized. The appraisal request, the representation made to the firm, the payment source,
the timeline relative to my surgery and my hospitalization. She placed printed copies of the key documents in front of each person at the table. I watched Dennis read the cover page of the appraisal. He didn't flinch. That was the thing that told me most about him. He read it, and he didn't flinch. Because somewhere in his mind, he had already rationalized this. He had a version of events that made him the reasonable one. I've been in enough contentious job sites to recognize the look of a man who has prepared his counter-argument so thoroughly that the facts themselves don't land for a moment. Carol said, "Dad, I want you to understand. This was meant to help. We were worried about you. We just wanted to understand your options." I said, "Carol, did you tell me you were worried?" She looked at the table. "Did any of you?" I said, and I looked at each of them. James, Diane, Carol. "Tell me you were concerned? Ask me about my plans? Sit down with me and say you wanted to understand my situation." Silence. "Because I would have had that conversation," I said. "I've been willing to have that conversation. I've been willing to talk about the house, the property, what happens to it when I'm gone. I'd have that conversation with any of you, any time. All you had to do was ask." Dennis uncrossed his ankle. He leaned forward slightly. He said, "Walter, I want to be straightforward with you. I was trying to do you a favor. At your stage of life, these are complicated decisions, and sometimes an outside perspective." I stopped him there. "Dennis," I said. I kept my voice where it's always lived. Quiet. The same temperature the whole way through. "I heard you say something similar at Christmas 2 years ago. At the table. You said that at my age, I probably didn't need to think about complicated things." He said nothing. "I want to tell you something about complicated," I said. "I have built load-bearing structures for 41 years. I have made decisions about what holds weight and what doesn't, in buildings that people live and sleep and raise their children in. I have never once made a cut without measuring. Never once trusted an assessment I didn't verify." I placed the document Felix had photographed on the table in front of Dennis. "You paid for this with my money, from an account with my name on it, without asking me, without telling me. And you timed it for a period when you expected me to be in no condition to notice." He looked at the document. "That's not a favor," I said. "That's a man who decided that at my age, I wasn't worth consulting." The room was very quiet. Carol put her hand over her mouth. James looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who has realized, too late, that the meeting he expected to be in is not the meeting he's actually in. Dennis said, slowly, "Walter, I think you're interpreting this in a way that—" "You don't need to explain it to me," I said. "I understand it. I understood it when I sat in a waiting room in Charlotte in January, and I heard someone on the phone from your firm asking about the valuation of the Asheville address. I just needed to measure before I spoke." He was quiet. It was the first time I had seen him quiet. I let it stay quiet for a moment. The way you let a joint set before you test it. The way you let a man hear his own silence. Then I said, "I'm not selling my house." Mira, on the video screen, wiped her face. She had known some of this, the outline of it, from the January phone call. What she hadn't known was the mechanism, the account, the timing. She said, when she finally spoke, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't push harder. In January when I called. I should have come out there." "You didn't know what you were pushing on," I said. "I knew something was wrong." "Yes," I said, "you did. And you called to ask about it. That matters." Diane hadn't said anything during the meeting. She hadn't needed to. She'd sat beside me the whole time, and that was its own sentence. its own clear statement of where she stood. After the meeting, when Carol and Dennis had gone out to their car, and Margaret was reorganizing her documents, and James was on his phone in the corner, Diane put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I looked at her. She looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't come to the hospital." I said, "What did he tell you?" She said, "That the doctor said it was better to wait, that you were resting, that he was handling things." She stopped. "I should have called the hospital myself. I should have just driven up. I knew it was wrong, and I talked myself into believing the excuse because it was easier." That is as honest as people get. I know that. I've built enough walls to know the difference between a crack in the plaster and a crack in the foundation. What Diane said was a crack in the foundation, and she knew it, and she was standing in it with her eyes open. "Drive up next time," I said. She nodded. She was crying, which is not like her. She's the toughest of my children. Gets it from Ruth. Same stubborn precision. Same refusal to make a scene except when a scene is warranted. "I will," she said. "I promise." I believe her. I believe her because she was there that morning without being told to be there. Dennis, when he left, did not speak to me. He walked out beside Carol, one hand at the small of her back, and when Carol turned to say something, I think she wanted to say something. I think she was trying to find words. He kept moving, and she followed. He has not called. I have not expected a call. He is not a man who admits error. He is a man who absorbs setbacks and recalculates. He will find another angle, another form of what he believes is practical thinking. I don't know what it will be. I know I'll see it when it comes. Because I know what I'm looking for now. I know what gets built in the dark, and I know what questions to ask, and I know which accounts to check. What I don't know is whether Carol will find her way back to me without him in the middle of it. She called 2 days after the meeting. We talked for 30 minutes. It was the realest conversation we'd had in years. Stilted in places, bruised in places, but real. She said she hadn't fully known about the account. I believe her. I believe she knew enough to be uncomfortable and not enough to say stop. That is a particular kind of not knowing that is also a choice. I told her so. She didn't deny it. We're not where we were. I don't know if we get back there, but we're talking. That's a start. It is May now. The hillside is green in the way it gets in May. That specific loud green of new growth, before summer thickens it to something older and darker. I have been sitting on my porch in the mornings with coffee and my father's watch, which I've been carrying again since the hospital. It's a habit I'd let lapse. I don't know why. Maybe I'd thought I was past the age of needing a reminder about time. Maybe I'd thought time was telling itself clearly enough. It wasn't. Dr. Osei cleared me for light activity. I've been walking. Not far. The hill is steep and my sternum is still teaching me what it means to have been divided and rejoined. But far enough. Down to the tree line and back. I can hear the house from there if I listen, though houses don't make sounds except in weather. It's more that I can feel it. The way you feel the weight of a structure you know well. The way a carpenter knows, at a specific distance, exactly how much a building costs to stand. Felix came by last week. He had a question about the saw I'd kept, the one I didn't sell, a handsaw with a rosewood handle that my father also used. He wanted to know if the set on the teeth was original, or if it had been refiled at some point. I told him I thought it was original, but I wasn't certain. We looked at it together for a while. He has the right kind of eyes for it, the kind that look past the surface. He said, "You doing okay, Walter?" I said, "Getting there." He nodded. He looked at the shop, the workbench, the pegboard, the tools I still have, He said, "You ever think about building something? Like a project? Nothing structural, just for the hands." I had thought about it. I'd been thinking about a small table. Oak, simple joinery, the kind of thing you make when you want to think carefully about each cut. I told him that. He said, "I'll come help if you want, when you're ready." I told him I'd let him know. He shook my hand and left. I stood in the shop for a while after, not doing anything, just being in the space. The light in there in the late afternoon comes in sideways through the one window on the west wall, and it catches the dust in a particular way that makes the air look solid. I've always liked that. Ruth used to come out and stand in it. She said it looked like something was being built, even when it wasn't. She said the light made it look like there were things in the air that you couldn't see in regular light. She was right. There are. I want to go back to the question I asked at the beginning. Who decided that my life, the one I built board by board, nail by nail, sacrifice by sacrifice, was no longer worth showing up for? I know the answer now. And the answer is more complicated than one man's name. Dennis decided it first. He decided it the way a man decides something he hasn't been asked, by looking at the surface of a thing and believing he understands the interior. He saw an old man with rough hands and a quiet voice, and a house on a hill, and he decided the asset was underperforming, and the manager was past his prime. He was thorough. He was organized. He was wrong in every way that counts. But he didn't do it alone. He needed an audience. He needed people who would accept his framing and not push back. Not because they were callous, but because he is convincing, and because it is easier to believe a confident man than to make a phone call and ask your father directly what he wants. My children, 3 of the 4, chose the easier thing. Carol, because she wanted her husband's opinion to be right. James, because a confident man in a good suit sounds like authority. Diane, because she told herself a story about why not going was acceptable, and she half believed it because fully believing it would have required her to be someone she doesn't actually want to be. They failed me. I say that plainly, not with anger, but with accuracy. A level doesn't lie about whether a surface is true, and I won't lie about what happened in March. They failed me, and they will have to decide what to do with that, and I will have to decide what I can build with what's left. Mira didn't fail me. She called. She pushed. She didn't come, but she didn't pretend everything was fine, and she asked the right question in the dark when she didn't have enough information yet. That counts. I know what it costs to ask a question when you're not sure you want the answer. And I'll tell you something else. The house is still standing. The foundation I poured in 1987 on a hill everyone said was too steep, it's still there, still carrying the weight. A structure doesn't collapse because someone wants it to. It collapses because of something wrong in the building. There is nothing wrong in the building. There is nothing wrong with me. I went back to the shop 2 weeks ago. Not for the table. The table is still a plan, still a thought I'm turning like a piece of wood to see the grain. I went back to check the level. I took it off the mantel and I carried it to the shop and I set it on the workbench on a surface I knew was flat. The bubble moved to center. Then I carried it outside. I set it on the porch railing, on the section I built 20 years ago that I'd been meaning to check. I'd meant to check it for 2 years. It had been one of those deferred tasks that accumulates the way a small lean in a wall accumulates. Slowly, invisibly, until you finally measure. The bubble was 1 line off center. Not much, not dangerous, but not right. I went back to the shop and got a shim. I fixed it that afternoon. It took about 20 minutes. When I was done, I set the level down on the railing again, and the bubble was center. I stood there for a while, with a watch in one hand and the level in the other, and I thought about my father, who gave me both of them, who believed they were the same instrument, who taught me that you can know the time exactly and still be standing on something that isn't level, and that both problems need fixing, and that neither one fixes itself. He was right about that. He was right about most things. He just never had enough words to say so, which is probably where I got that from. There's one more thing I want to tell you. The week after the meeting in Margaret's office, I got a letter, handwritten on plain paper in the handwriting of a man who learned to write when handwriting was still taught carefully. It was from a man named Gerald Briggs. He'd been a contractor I worked alongside 25 years ago on a commercial project in Arden, North Carolina, a building with a complicated foundation on uncertain ground. We'd worked together for 7 months. I hadn't heard from him in 15 years. He'd heard from a mutual contact that I'd had surgery. He wrote to say he hoped I was recovering. He wrote that he'd thought about that Arden project sometimes, that the building had had a fire in 2019 and the structure had held. The firefighters had gotten everyone out because the walls stayed up long enough. He thought I'd want to know. He hoped I was well. He signed it with his full name and included his phone number. I called him. We talked for an hour. His wife had died 2 years ago, same quiet way Ruth went. He'd retired to the coast, had a woodworking shop, was building Adirondack chairs and giving them to the neighbors. I asked him if he'd heard about the fire before or after. After, he said. Found it by accident, reading a local article about the restoration. Recognized the address. That building should have come down, I said. That's what they thought, he said, but it didn't. No, I said. We were quiet for a moment, the way old men in the trades are quiet when there's nothing left to explain. Some things hold, he said. Yes, I said. They do. I'm sitting on the porch now, with the last of the morning coffee. The green is going bright on the hillside. A woodpecker has been working at the dead oak at the tree line for 3 days. Methodical, returning to the same spot. A man with a specific job and the patience to do it right. I've watched him from here. He knows where the hollow is. He came back until he found it. The pocket watch is on the table beside me. My father's. Brass case, white face, Roman numerals. I pick it up and open it. The second hand is moving. Steady, indifferent, accurate. 9 days I lay in that room and no one came. The answer to the question is, Dennis decided, and 3 of my children let him. And I am still here, and the house is still standing, and the bubble is centered, and some things hold. The table I'm going to build, the oak one, the one with the careful joinery, I've decided it will have 4 legs. Simple mortise and tenon, the kind of joint where each piece needs the other to stay true. The kind that fails only if you cut it wrong, and if you cut it right, outlasts the man who built it. I'll start it next week, maybe the week after. I'm not in a hurry. A man who's been measuring all his life knows that the right time to cut is when you're sure of the line. I'm sure of the line. And one last thing, something I've been sitting with since I came home from that hospital. There were 9 days, and in those 9 days, 2 people showed up. A nurse named Thomas, who talked to me like a person, and a cardiologist who checked on me every other day without being asked. Neither one of them was obligated to anything beyond the job. Both of them did more than the job required. I have been thinking about what that means, about where obligation ends and decency begins, and whether the people who are supposed to love you are actually more or less likely to show up than strangers. Maybe you've been in a room like that. Maybe you know what I mean. Maybe the person who showed up for you was someone you didn't expect. And maybe the person you expected is still somewhere you haven't looked.
If this story landed somewhere real for you, if something in it felt familiar, I'd be glad to know. Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because there are more of these. There are always more of these. Walter Greer lives in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house he built himself in 1987. He is 68 years old. He is in good health.